Okay, so visual information after it arrives into the columns, of cortex that you find back here in primary visual cortex, or V1, or which is sometimes called striate cortex because of the great big striped layer of input, at the input layer at layer 4. There is then output, via the more superficial layers of these cortical columns, out into the temporal lobes, into the sort of ventral temporal lobes, where networks are going to be organized based upon what it is you're actually seeing, whether it's a dog or a cat or a brain or a cup of coffee or a face. So there's definite kind of projections into this ventral temporal region that are critical for recognizing objects. So the temporal lobe, one of its sort of main functional attributes is object recognition. And what's interesting about this is that the inputs that are actually working their way into the temporal lobes to allow for you to identify specific objects in what's known as the ventral sort of what pathway in the temporal lobes are derived from the sort of foveal inputs, because you need that sort of detail to be able to extract information, about what this particular object happens to be, right? So we talk about how the fovea, right, has the cone cells, most of the cone cells sort of tightly packed in there, and they are connected via these smaller bipolar cells. They actually have a very politically incorrect name. They're called midget bipolar cells, to these tiny ganglion cells that have to be packed in there, right? And these tiny ganglion cells are called the Parvo cellular ganglion cells, or the P ganglion cells. So the P ganglion cells are actually sending output, their axons, that form the majority actually of the optic nerve, since most of the output from the eye, from the retina, is going to actually be from that foveal region. And the P ganglion cells, are forming what we call sort of the P pathway, basically, out of the retinas, and that's foveal. That's going to be detail. That's going to be color. That's going to require daylight. So along this ventral pathway, this what pathway, out of primary visual cortex, sort of into these areas here, are regions that are involved in, for example, color discrimination, an area known as V4, which seems to be sort of essential for the support of our ability to sort of detect or perceive colors. Not detect, that happens here in the eyes, but perceive, the redness of red or the greenness of green. And then there are other areas that are sort of involved in shape detection, and there's a very well-developed and well-defined network now in the sort of ventral regions here that's involved in recognition of faces, including a very important gyrus known as the fusiform gyrus, the fusiform face area. You've got columns of cells that are responsive to, say eyes, a particular distance apart, eyes, nose, and mouth in particular, relationships. And, if you are able to, look at the front of a car, like a grill of a car with the headlights and the grill there, and, suddenly perceive it, kind of as a face, like it has a face with like emotional impact and all that, you're going to definitely have activity, in the fusiform face area in the temporal lobe as part of that what pathway that's actually helping you, to do that, to fuse those various elements into the form of a face. And then further, as you get all the way to this anterior pole of the temporal lobe up here, these areas seem to be organized, the columns here, based upon specific individual faces, like, the faces of different people that for example, or famous faces, that on our site here, there's actually a test you could take to test your ability to recognize faces, because it turns out about 6% of the U.S. population has a form of visual agnosia. A means nothing. Nosia is gnosis or knowledge. And it's a particular form of, loss of knowledge about recognizing objects that's specific to faces. It's called prosopagnosia. And it's actually relatively common, about 6% of the population. Now, in addition to knowing what, a specific object that you may be, perceiving visually is, that's dependent upon, distribution of visual information, from the P pathway, from the foveal inputs, from the small ganglion cells sort of back that make up the bulk of the ganglion cell output, via the primary visual cortex into these ventral temporal regions. That's part of that what pathway for recognizing objects in vision. You also need to know where those objects are in relationship to your body, right? So this information also works its way up through sort of the middle of the temporal lobe, but then up into the parietal lobe. This is called the sort of more dorsal, where pathway. This is going to be visual information, much of it coming from the M-type ganglion cells. These are the magnocellular, the large ganglion cells that are receiving information from the much bigger bipolar cells that are called diffuse bipolar cells in the retina that are gathering lots and lots and lots and lots of rod cell input. So they're much better at detection of motion, right? Of things that move across and are captured by multiple rod cells that are all connected to these great big diffuse bipolar cells and these great big M-type magnocellular large ganglion cell outputs. So this is more of the M-type projections, from the periphery of the retina that are giving you information about motion and location and acceleration. And all this stuff is integrated with, somatosensory input, right? That arrives at the primary somatosensory cortex in the postcentral gyrus of the parietal lobe, right? This is S1. Remember all that information about tactile, discrimination and proprioception, position sense. And also we'll see that vestibular information about acceleration, sort of angular acceleration, right? Linear acceleration, gravity, tilt, is also going to be integrated in the parietal lobe. So the parietal lobes are, part of this where pathway, and they're integrating visual information, largely sort of peripheral about motion, with somatosensory, but specifically about sort of tactile and proprioceptive position sense, and also vestibular kind of acceleration information to build up a spatial map of your body in relation, spatially to objects and events that are out here in the world. And there's regions here, for example, on this pathway from, the sort of where pathway from the primary primary visual cortex and occipital lobe up through the temporal lobe into here. There's an area called MT where the columns are organized based upon the direction of motion. So, for example, if things are moving in this direction, it'll set off this particular column in area MT. And then if you tilt the direction, if you move it like this way all of a sudden, that column will stop firing, but the next column will fire. And then you move it a slightly different direction, and you'll get the next column. And then there's an area called MST, that's, middle superior temporal, that's projected from area MT. And that area, that's very involved in things that are swirling out or swirling in. So it's giving you information about things that are coming this way or going that way in terms of perception. So the what pathway is largely the foveal information that derive from cone cells, the little bipolar cells, to the Parvo cellular ganglion cells, the P ganglion cells, the little ganglion cells, working their way back, forming the bulk of the cabling that comes out of the each optic nerve, and then working their way into the columns of primary visual cortex, and then working their way into the what pathway, which is found along this ventral temporal region of neocortex here. It allows you to identify specific objects, including faces, and aspects of object identification like color and shape and form are going to definitely be dependent upon networks that are located in this what pathway, this sort of ventral temporal, kind of P cell derived, foveally derived, pathway, while the periphery of the retina, the rod cells, that are being captured by large diffuse bipolar cells and big magnocellular ganglion cells, the M ganglion cells, their projections are going to work their way also back into primary visual cortex, but they're going to work their way largely in this more dorsal, upwards way, through the temporal lobe and into the parietal lobe for identifying, where things happen to be located. And that information is going to be integrated, right? That visual information about, location and movement with vestibular and also somatosensory